Welcome back, everybody, into Bill's Chat. I am Josh McCarty. With me, as always, is Luka. Luka, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. As it's pretty apparent, usually we are recording at night, but right behind me here, it is bright and sunny. So if anyone hasn't been able to figure it out, we're not recording at our usual time. It is daytime. So I'm a little bit more awake than I usually am as we're sitting here behind the mic. So feeling fantastic and everything's good.
As Sean McDermott would say, as long as we get the best version of yourself, we are good to go. Just do your 1/11th, or in this case, do your one tooth. One tooth. Luka, training camp opens this week. I know the rookies reported last week, and that's kind of cool, but really, this week is when it all starts. It's when the beat reporters are at camp, and it's going to be like more so next week, and they're reporting on every play, and so looks great, so looks terrible. I live and die by it. To me, it's great. It's not like the EJ Manuel days when you were so desperate for a quarterback that anytime he had a good practice, you start to believe, like, we know we have a good quarterback. I don't care if Josh Allen throws 6 interceptions in practice, just don't get hurt. But what is your attitude toward these training camp practices? Is it cool? Is it something you keep up with? Or are you more so just like, please nobody get hurt, and let me kind of figure out what's going on with some of these position battles?
It's the same thing every year. It's like, yeah, primarily don't want to hear any bad news. Don't want to hear any major injury things, especially your non-contacts, practice canceled early situations, anything like that, your Teddy Bridgewater situation. Please, for the love of God, do not have something like that, where it basically took to the point where you had PTSD counseling to players for what they had witnessed.
Yeah.
But overall, it's one of those things where that's where I'm at. I do enjoy the occasional clip it, where you see something that was interesting. It's fun to see, like, kind of splash plays, whatever it might be, offensively, defensively, regardless of what that is, it is fun. Occasionally you have that guy that kind of blows up out of nowhere, or, someone that was just looked at as, 7th on the depth chart, but hey, he's making splash play day after day. So maybe he's going to be one to then watch come preseason game 1 or whatever it is. So those are fun to kind of follow along with. But overall, yeah, I don't care regardless. As you kind of mentioned, it's not about trying to figure out who our QB1 is come opening day or anything of that severity where there's an unknown going into the season of that level. We all know 17 will be under center. And because of that, we have a good chance to win the division. And overall, we'll just see how the season progresses. So hopefully in training camp throughout the preseason, there's just no major injuries, no scares, nothing like that then kind of raise question marks on where the season's going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a Denver Nuggets fan, and just, for context, like their number one draft pick tore his ACL in summer league. His season's already over. Now, granted, number one draft picks in the NBA aren't necessarily expected to do what number one draft picks in NFL are supposed to do, but it's just a reminder that everything sounds good until it doesn't, and then things can change on the drop of a dime. So you do hope that the Bills have good health, good fortune. I look at training camp, Luka, I liken it to being a kid around Christmas time. And if you kind of remember what it was like to be a kid at Christmas time, it's like when you go to school for that last day before Christmas break. That, to me, when school lets out, is training camp. Like, you're not to Christmas yet. You probably still have like a week until actual Christmas Day, but man, you can smell it. That's what training camp is. Like, we're not to the games yet. We're not even to the preseason games yet, but it's coming. And it's right around the corner. And for guys like Luka and myself, who, we view football season for, college, pro, and everything it means betting wise, and just the fun of sports as like the ultimate time of the year, it's an exciting time. So that's what I mainly get excited about with training camp. But because training camp opens this week, and I think this year for the Bills was so much roster turnover, there's a lot of interesting storylines in camp. And that's what we're going to do today on this podcast. Is we're really going to do like a training camp primer for the Bills. We have 4 different bigger picture topics that we are going to take in a variety of directions. We're going to give our thoughts on it, our predictions on it, and we hope you enjoy what we are going to bring to you. And Luka, I think it only makes sense to start with the offense and specifically the passing game, because talk about unbelievable turnover. Ken Dorsey out, Joe Brady in as a full-time coordinator, not as a midseason coordinator change running Ken Dorsey's book. Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis out. 86% of the receiving targets from last year from wide receivers out the door. Mitch Morse out. Keon Coleman used with the first pick in the draft for the Bills. The only receiver on the roster, wide receiver, that caught a pass from Josh Allen in his career is Khalil Shakir. Let's start with that first round, I guess second round draft pick, Keon Coleman. What are your expectations for him year one? I think this is a wild card because you could look at it and say, holy cow, 86% of the wide receiver targets have been vacated. Keon Coleman was taken with their first pick. He's about to go nuts. Or you could say it's a paint by numbers scenario. What happens with Keon Coleman year one for the Buffalo Bills?
I think that the very end of what you had just said there is valid, where it makes it polarizing, or almost the wild card of the unknown is there among a lot of fans, where you can see both worlds being true, where maybe he will be a target whore if everything's going well. Yeah, sorry.
I love it.
That's
NFL terminology right there, folks.
Yeah, that's hey, they use it in the industry. No. So maybe that will be the case if he has a strong training camp, if he looks very, very good, if in any preseason action, so on and so forth, where they're like, hey, screw it. We're going to have some training wheels on this guy come week one against the Cardinals. Let's just see what he's got. And then all of a sudden he receives 14 targets and things are out the gate going. That would be the ideal of ideal worlds, of course. Realistically, I do think there's going to be a little growing pains, training wheel situation where it's understandable for someone, especially going up to the pros and not having that full off season yet, kind of needing getting up to speed time to really get their footing and understand what's going on. The offense is complex and everything like that. So overall, especially comparative to what you run in college, no matter where you are. So effectively, he's just going to need probably time where he's going to be, I'm not going to say he's lost in the shuffle. He's just a part of the shuffle that is the receiving options. That's just what he's going to be, especially early on. As the season progresses, I can see a guy like Keon, if there's a rapport there, if you're noticing kind of a connection really being well established with Allen and trust is being developed and all of that's going, it could then steadily increase as we're getting into the later parts of the season, into the more important games. And next thing you know, another ideal world would be that he becomes a very key contributor as they made the playoffs to kind of make another push that is great in what a lot of national media or even individuals from the outside look at as a more of transition-ish year for the Bills. Now, it's hard to call it a full rebuild or even a rebuild of some variety when you have 17 under center. That's why it's transition. I feel like that's the catchphrase that people like to use, because you're never fully rebuilding when you have a top 3 quarterback in the league. So right. Overall with Keon, that's kind of what I expect. I expect the latter of what I was kind of talking about, where there could be a progression. He's going to be in that shuffle, everything like that. And there is a scenario, there is a world out there where maybe the speed is just too much for him in the sense of figuring out the offense, really being kind of that guy who can be leaned on as a perimeter option. And they just do need to lean more so on your Curtis Samuel, your Khalil Shakirs, everyone else, your Mac Hollins, all those guys who are in their NFL vets now at this point. They all have figured it out, and they'll be able to kind of run the show as Keon just still makes his splash contributions wherever that may be. That's, that world does exist as well. And I think pinpointing it down, I think that middle one I mentioned, where it could be a little bit slow out of the gates, but as the season progresses, similar to the trajectory we saw with Kincaid. Now his was kind of amplified due to injury to Knox, which just gave him an even better opportunity mid-season to thrive. But I can see something similar happening to a Keon Coleman, where it takes him about a month or two to really figure it out, get his footing, really get up to speed, and then from there, take advantage of any opportunities thrown his way, where then come next season, I think that's where we then become very comfortable with the Keon Coleman being a number one situation at the perimeter, and we hit the ground running from there.
It's apples to oranges, but I'm going to ask you a few questions here. One, would you take Dalton Kincaid's season for Keon Coleman? Again, apples to oranges, different position, and he had Dawson Knox standing in his way for a good chunk of the season. But let's just go with the stat line. Dalton Kincaid, last year in his rookie year, 73 receptions on 91 targets, 2 touchdowns, 673 yards. Let me make sure he played all. Yeah, he only played 16 games. Did Kincaid miss a game? He did miss a game.
Yeah, he missed a game because of was it concussion?
Yeah, it was something where
Yeah.
it wasn't like a really high quality opponent, so I wasn't overly worried about it.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Okay. So 70 something catches for 600 and something yards and a couple scores. I would take it. I don't know if I'd be thrilled about it. I would take it though. It to me, the biggest the biggest indicator that it's okay would be the 71 catches aspect of that. Now the
mhm.
output would be disappointing of what you're getting out of that. But if I think there could be a multitude of reasons of why that would be a minimal output, right? If you're getting 71 catches and yet somehow you're not getting big plays and stuff of
Yeah.
that nature, they're trying to get you the ball, but you're just not doing anything with it. And or maybe what they're throwing you is just a lot of easy catches, let's say close to the line, whatever it is, to just get comfortable. And Keon Coleman, it's not like he has that second, third gear to really explode and make plays happen. He can in open space, he can make a guy miss potentially and stuff, but he's not known as a burner, of course, and things like that. So if you're putting him in the box essentially to make an easy catch, he's probably getting tackled instantaneously if someone's there in the NFL. And that's something as well where he's going to have to learn the NFL speed, because in college, maybe he was able to catch, look, make a move and open that up. Whereas in the NFL, that space probably won't be there anymore. So that's going to be a learning curve for him. But I guess, yeah, to answer the question and kick it back to you, there wouldn't be a disappointment in a sense of, okay, at least they trust him, one, and he's gotten a lot of touches, so he's getting there. But it comes with a little bit of an asterisk where disappointment is there in the sense of it wasn't anything better, being that it would be that many receptions.
And the tricky part of that is what you called out from the beginning. That is an awfully low ADOT for a wide receiver if he has that. So
Yeah.
as far as like the stat line goes, 600 to 700 yards, a couple touchdowns, I think I'd be disappointed with the red zone output, but I could see a path where the Bills are successful and Coleman is just more of a role player year one, because I do think there's a lot of belief in that building in Shakir. Obviously, they believe in Curtis Samuel. Maybe you get a surprise season out of someone like a Chase Claypool, and then obviously Kincaid and Knox are going to factor in along with the running backs. But I think what's tricky about receivers is it's very easy to say, well, look how fast wide receivers come in and hit the ground running. And there's like this long list of examples of doing so. I mean, look no further than last year. Puka Nacua comes in and gets 105 receptions for nearly 1,500 yards. That would be amazing. We would all take that out of Keon Coleman. But when you look at the rest of that rookie class, the next highest receiving output is Rashee Rice, 938 yards, 7 touchdowns. Jordan Addison, 991 or 911, 10 touchdowns. Nobody else in that class had over 900 yards. And actually, the fourth person on the list is a tight end in Sam Laporta. And we all look at guys like Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Josh Downs, kind of go down the list, and you remember them having good productive years for their team. But when you look at the season in totality, it really equated to more of like 700 to 800 yards.
Yeah.
That's where I think the target is for Coleman. Somebody in this class, history says it, somebody in this class is going to explode. But there are some dudes in this class, Marvin Harrison, Neighbors for the Giants, and there's nobody in either of those guys' way to take targets away. So I think there's no rule that says only one guy can blow up. But since 2000, I had this in front of me. Since 2000, we have only seen 16 receivers break 1,000 yards, and that goes back to like Anquan Bolden in 2003. And more recent examples, you had guys like Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua, who we already mentioned, and there was another one, Justin Jefferson, break 1,400 yards, but those guys are outliers. Other than that, the most recent example of a guy, doing really well is Garrett Wilson, 1,100 yards, and then it was like Chris Olave just over 1,000. If Keon Coleman breaks 1,000 yards year one, I think we all do handstands and get really excited about his future. But to me, the sweet spot for him is around 700 to 800 yards. And like Lucas said, the most important part is he continuing to get better as the season goes on. What you don't want to see is a hot start and then a plateau. You want to see continuous improvement and continuous comfortability out of Keon Coleman. So we are absolutely aligned on that. Who is going to lead this team in targets, Luka?
If you want me to just fire from the hip real quick, I believe that answer will be Dalton Kincaid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think as I even have noted here, and I think the conversation more kind of bleeds immediately into, does it really matter? And that's where I would be very curious to know how people feel. But I feel like I've maintained this feeling about targets because you listen to all the pundits whenever the Bills come up. The biggest question naturally is, well, they have Josh Allen, but who's Josh Allen throwing to? Yada, yada, yada. And they talk about how they lost Diggs, they lost Davis, all this. And what I think happened, that it doesn't necessarily get overlooked, but it just kind of gets partially forgotten, is the transition away from the massive target based offense had already occurred last season in the second half, where we saw a philosophical change and there was a much more lean on inside the numbers offensively. You had your James Cook games happening. You had Dalton Kincaid getting used much more. Knox came back and he was still getting his fair share of targets. Shakir, who primarily was coming out of the slot, was also, of course, exploding. Things like that were happening where the perimeter no longer became that dependent place for Josh Allen to find Diggs whenever needed. It wasn't, hey, Diggs is down there somewhere, let me just find him in a pinch. That still happened occasionally. It happened, unfortunately, in one of the most crucial points of the season where Diggs just came up short, or his hands came up short. But overall, it's one of those things where I don't think targets ultimately matter. I think the offense we should, at least at this moment, be expecting should be something we saw, of course, in the second half of the season, when that's who's now running the show full time. And it's going to be a communal kind of target share. It's going to be game by game basis, I would imagine. Is it going to be a James Cook game? Is it going to be a Dalton Kincaid game? Is it going to be a Shakir game? Is it going to be a Keon / Mac Hollins / perimeter game? Is it Curtis Samuel going to get utilized? There's kind of a much more variety of weapon in this offense now than there has been in seasons past. And I think what that does is open up that avenue where you can get a little bit more opponent specific on how you'd like to attack things. And that's great. What that does, though, is it reduces the total targets to a one individual. And 1 week, it's going to make fantasy owners really, really upset, because ultimately what's going to happen is, unless you have Josh Allen, you can't guarantee anything for you on this Bills offense week in, week out. It could change drastically. Now, the ceilings of all of them in fantasy terms could still be very, very high. It's just your floors are now much lower due to that fact. And whereas Kincaid, let's call it, since I said he will most likely end the season with the most targets, because I think he'll be probably your next most consistent usage player in this offense. I'm not including James Cook in this conversation because we're talking targets, of course. He will also have his running back share, running the ball. But with the receivers, Kincaid's probably your most steady Eddie looking target. So week in, week out, yes, the game plan may change, but I still think your Kincaid targets are going to happen where you have 2, 3, 4 at least. And then there's going to be certain games where he will probably bleed into the 8, 9, maybe even approach double digits, depending on game plan, because we already saw that there's clear chemistry between him and Allen. We saw the highs and what was going on, especially when Knox was out last year. And when you sprinkle in on top of it that there is no longer that Diggs there and stuff of that, Allen's going to have to find that new guy he trusts. And it effectively becomes a fight between Shakir and Kincaid. And I would just think that it did feel like the offense is switching into something where in the box, in between the numbers, Kincaid getting utilized to find those pockets of space kind of in that second level there is going to be something that we're going to expect to see a little bit more often. So I'm just going to tip my hat to Kincaid. But the ultimate answer is I don't think it really matters anyways.
I think Kincaid's probably the easy answer. And I don't mean that as any kind of a knock on you. I think that's more of a, like you mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty with the wide receivers. Like they drafted Keon Coleman high, but you and I can certainly think of a world where Keon Coleman isn't on the field as much as two other receivers, Curtis Samuel or Shakir. Maybe you want to plant your flag on Curtis Samuel, but you could see a world where maybe they did bring him in to just be a highly paid gadget guy. And his reality is much more of like that number 3 receiver that he has, by the way, traditionally been in his career. I want to run a number real quick because I just stumbled into something while you were chatting. That is wild. Okay, I'm going to bring this up because I am going to plant my flag on Khalil Shakir. And I think it's tricky because of a lot of the stuff you mentioned. I do think there's going to be a concentrated effort to get Kincaid involved. And I don't want to not mention the running backs, because last year, when you look at what happened after Joe Brady took over, the running backs paced for over 700 receiving yards combined. That was between James Cook and Ty Johnson and Latavius Murray. When you look at their numbers, what they accomplished in those 8 games under Joe Brady, if you extrapolate that over 17 games, the running backs would have accounted for 700 yards. There's going to be a lot of offense going through the running backs through the air. The reason why I'm planting my flag on Khalil Shakir is really threefold. One, he is the one that has familiarity with Josh Allen. I just came over a wild stat, Luka. Khalil Shakir had 45 targets last year and he caught 39 passes.
Yep.
That means only 6 balls that were intended for Khalil Shakir didn't wind up in his hands. That's not catchable passes. That's not drops. That's anything. Josh Allen throws the ball in his direction and it's a catch. If you want a comparison's sake, Stephon Diggs had 107 targets, or I'm sorry, 160 targets, 107 catches. Khalil Shakir converted 86% of his targets into catches. Stephon Diggs was 66. 86% is tremendous. Smaller sample size. That's hard to keep up with. But that says something about the rapport between Josh Allen and Khalil Shakir. When you go back to after Joe Brady took over, Stephon Diggs' usage went way down. Khalil Shakir's usage went way up. Khalil Shakir was only on the field for 24 snaps per game under Ken Dorsey. Under Joe Brady, that got bumped up to 51 snaps per game. I also think, even though Shakir was a primary slot receiver last season, he ran nearly 30% of his snaps on the boundary under Joe Brady after being right around 25 under Ken Dorsey. I feel really good about the fact that Khalil Shakir is going to be a high volume player for this team. I think he can win short. I think he has Josh Allen's trust. He's the only guy on this team with familiarity with the quarterback. And if I had to pick a receiver today that I felt most comfortable would go over 1,000 yards, I'd plant my flag on Khalil Shakir, Luka.
That's absolutely fair. The conversion ratio of target to catch for Khalil Shakir has always been there. As you mentioned, the key kind of asterisk is sample size. It's been pretty small for him overall. Not to his discredit, it's just, that's just the way it is. And I'm pretty sure even with that, what was it, 45 you said? No, yeah, 45 targets.
39 to 45.
Yeah. So even with that, I bet you if you did it game breakdown, it was a vast majority in the second half of last year when we saw that transition happen. And Shakir is, I think right now, when you look at it, at the receiver position, the true explosive player as of this moment, where he should be able to provide you a vast array of ways he can kind of blow up. It's not one simple way. It's like Curtis Samuel is open field, get him going. Once he hits that second gear, he's hard to tackle. I don't think he's bad in the sense of he can't do other things once in a while, but it's not like I'm expecting him to shrug off a tackle or anything. Shakir, we've seen do that. Shakir, we've seen, make the spectacular catch, land his 2 feet and turn and go as well. We've seen him do it a multitude of ways that I'm comfortable thinking that he's probably your downfield most explosive threat you will have game in, game out. And it's like when you combine that with the steady Eddie feel of Kincaid, who can still make big plays happen, but of course he is just still Kincaid. So I'm not going to sit here and say, he's Tyreek Hill at tight end kind of deal. And then you have James Cook in the backfield, who is of course as explosive as possible coming out of there. Those 3 phases are a great place to be. And then we're having this discussion about targets. Yeah, I don't see how it's hard to believe that Shakir wouldn't be that guy. There could be a world where we see Shakir even get more looks on the perimeter based on whatever personnel packages it is, whatever they're trying to achieve that week. If they see a mismatch, that Shakir could be the guy to exploit because maybe they have just a bigger kind of stronger corner outside that, yes, your Keon Coleman could, maybe out physical, but he's not going to get behind him. Whereas a Shakir could, whatever that might be. So I do like that take. And there's now 2 seasons of rapport between him and Allen where, of course, and you hear a lot of the quotes come out once in a while, that Allen has high praise for Shakir. Brandon Beane, of course, absolutely loves him. McDermott has praise for Shakir. And you even see these silly over the top posts and stuff where it's like, is Shakir the next elite receiver? And it's like, okay, let's tone it down a notch. I know what you're doing over there, social media. I get it. But overall, there's a reason that even outlandish kind of post comes. And it's because it's someone trying to blow up these quotes and these things that you clearly see that are there, and those are factual, that they do believe in this guy, and it could absolutely happen the way you're saying it.
Yeah, let's walk before we run, people. Let's let Khalil Shakir become a very good starting receiver for this
crazy
team
thought.
First.
Let's let him get 90 plus catches first.
I mean,
crazy thought.
wild thought you have there, Luka. But what is this all going to amount to? What does 2024 look like for Josh Allen, Luka? He lost his number 1 receiver. He lost his number 2 receiver. He lost his starting center. There's some shuffling up front. He has a new offensive coordinator, did take over mid-season in Joe Brady, but was running Ken Dorsey's playbook. Has only 1 receiver on the team in Khalil Shakir that it caught a pass for him in his entire career. So looking at all of that, insert Keon Coleman, bringing in Curtis Samuel. What does it look like for Josh Allen in 2024?
I don't. It's going to be different, but not at the end of the day feel different. I'm trying to figure out how to word this. I think the overall output of Josh Allen will be the same. I genuinely believe this. I think come season's end, barring any serious injury to his arm, to whatever else is going on, of course, I think you get a full 17 game healthy Josh Allen, or we'll say 16 plus, because hopefully that 17th game he could rest himself maybe if all things go very well. But all things go well, I think the end result of Josh Allen, productivity wise, output wise, everything like that will be very similar, which is very good for him in the sense of the public eye, because I think this can be truly a shut up season for the doubters, for the haters, for anyone else, because all the crutches are gone. I think this is the first year where truly you cannot say that there's anything that you can say, yeah, but when it comes to Josh Allen as he performs, I truly, of course, if turnovers are still happening, let's say 1 pick every week, hopefully it's not 1 every week, but let's say a vast majority of the weeks, that's still going to be the thing that people will try to dig at. But I think even that one is starting to fade away. People are just recognizing that he's the biggest kind of win above replacement in modern history. Like, you can't replace what he does. So with that in mind, how it's going to be achieved is not going to be a one-man show. Of course, we've talked about all that and things like that, and kind of even digging into the training camp aspect of this episode. What will be intriguing is to see who the relationships are that he kind of shows off a little bit in training camp, and things like that, where is it going to be just heavy Kincaid and Shakir, and does nothing else really come of any of the other weapons? Do we see Keon bloom early and kind of Josh Allen raise an eyebrow and go, oh, okay, let's see what more we can do with him? Is Curtis Samuel going to explode and catch Josh Allen by somewhat surprise? I would imagine he won't be overly surprised. He has tape of what he can do. So, things like that, those will be intriguing. And then on top of it all, I love in our notes how you had specifically said prediction for Allen, Post, Diggs, Davis, and Morse. The other thing will be, how does he command an offensive line and do things and have that rapport with his center now that it is someone else that he's putting his hands in between the legs of, we'll call it. It will be fascinating to see that, but I just believe that Allen is the type of player. Allen is, of course, been the type of player that he is for years now, where it's hard to bet against him. And I would imagine that he can elevate players around him as best as they can be great. So I just believe that the end of day output will be similar to everything we've seen. It just will look different because you don't have your Diggs out there. You don't have the guys you're used to seeing surrounding him the past 3-4 seasons. So that will just take an adjustment. But we will most likely, hopefully, see the rise of Shakir, the rise of, or continuous growth of Kincaid, hopefully maybe even some flash from Keon. You'll see your Curtis sprinkled in there, stuff like that, where it will be a fun new taste to this offense that then should hopefully have that complement behind him in Cook. That my dream scenario is that we can see what we saw in that Dallas game happen a handful of times again, where Josh Allen feels like he just showed up, put on his pads, and he barely broke a sweat. Like, that would be fantastic. We need to see more of that so that it doesn't feel like it's on his back week in, week out. And he can believe that, hey, this week we have a game plan in place where I'm hopefully only throwing the ball 25 times. That would be awesome. Like, I guarantee he looks forward to those weeks. If you think that any quarterback doesn't look forward to those weeks, I think you're foolish. I think they themselves will tell you, it's like, sometimes we need a break. Sometimes your elites of your elites, your Rodgers in his peak and all of this stuff, it's like they need breaks once in a while. And they love those weeks where it's like, this is going to be a 40 carry game here, and we're going to lean on these guys in the backfield. It's like, hell yes. And I would love to see that happen more often this season.
Yeah, I think they certainly have put themselves in position to do that. I see I'm dropping bars here, so I'll keep my answer. Keep my answer a little bit short. I think we're going to see more of what we've seen. Josh Allen the last 4 years has gone over 4,200 yards. Last year was the first time he didn't eclipse 30 touchdown passes, but he also added 15 touchdown runs, which is just insane when you think about it. I think Josh Allen will continue to push for 40 total touchdowns. Josh Allen will break 4,000 yards. And I do think there's a real path to him limiting the turnovers because, one, there's not that inherent pressure to get the dude the ball. When you have a Stephon Diggs on your team, there's a lot of benefits that come with that. There's a lot of coverage that goes his way. You have a stud receiver on your team, but there's also a lot of pressure on the quarterback to keep him happy. And that's not a Diggs thing. That's an alpha wide receiver thing. And that's not here right now. Josh Allen doesn't have any mouths to feed to keep happy. He's got a bunch of guys where he's the alpha in that huddle now. I think that'll help him not force things too. I think there's going to be a lot of shorter, safer throws to guys like Curtis Samuel, where you're generating yards for him, generating him in open spaces, sort of like the Niners kind of do with Debo. They are going to throw the ball in the flats to the running backs. I think they are going to throw a lot to Kincaid over the middle, safer passes. Keon Coleman, not necessarily a high ADOT guy, in my opinion, when it comes to the NFL, much more of a catch and make stuff happen after the catch. So I think that this offense, just by the nature of it, is going to be less turnover friendly, or maybe more turnover or more protect the ball friendly. That's what I want to say. So I could see that. And I think Josh Allen will have a very good year statistically. And I think there will be a really hard case to make that he's not in the MVP conversation, because I expect him to put up his typical Josh Allen numbers without the optics of, holy cow, he's got the best receiving group in the league. I think Chris Sims has been onto something, by the way. I think Josh Allen's weapons have been overrated for a while. And I don't know how much of a drop off there is this year. I think there's a drop off. I'm not sure how much. All right, Luka, let's talk about Matt Milano and let's talk about injuries, because unfortunately, one thing consistent with these Buffalo Bills is coming into training camp, there's been injury concerns around a star player for the last couple of years. Last year, it was Von Miller. The year before that, it was Tre'Davious White. This year, it's Matt Milano. And we've seen through minicamp and OTAs that Milano's been out there doing a little bit of stuff. The Bills have been kind of coy about his status, not committing to the fact he's going to be ready to go as soon as camp opens. Two-part question for you. One, how optimistic are you that Matt Milano will be ready to go by the first game of the season? Two, how optimistic are you that the Bills will see the same version of Matt Milano that they had pre-injury?
To answer the latter first, not optimistic. I think it's, we touched on it even last episode, but it's, it's more warranted. It's further conversation is more warranted. Ooh, we got through that point. Where it's just, I think it's foolish to expect it, especially how severe that injury was, or is, depending on where it stands. But I think you're going to still have the same player between the ears. So, the smart Matt Milano will be there. It'll probably take a little bit to get him game sharp, we'll call it, between the ears. But overall, he's still the same player mentally. The physical kind of limitations that will come with still the recovery process to get back to 100% will be there for weeks to come. That is the nature of the beast. That is severe injuries. We, of course, had the biggest prime example with Von Miller last year. And even you saw it with Trey White going into last season before he had then another injury on top of it, where they're not themselves. It will feel disappointing in a sense, but I think there is that caution that should be there, or the realism that is, you can't just expect this guy to be a free. You can't expect Adrian Peterson in, what was it, 2009 or 2012 or whatever it was, when he tore his ACL and then magically came back and was the best running back in the league still. Like that is freakish upon freakish. That is one of one. No one else does that. It's, you have to understand that these are serious injuries and it takes time to come back. Now, to the former and things like that, I think there's a good chance that he's back come season start. I would find it that way. You haven't heard anything about him starting on PUP, although I don't think they have to officially report that until camp starts. But it's not like there's been, rumors out there that that's supposedly what's going to happen or anything like that. And I think that's a good sign. I think that's a great sign that he's going to come into camp. He's not going to be on the PUP, and we're going to, at least the coaching staff, the training staff, everyone else is going to get a good look of him kind of in walkthroughs, soft practices, whatever it is that he's capable of, and see where he goes. From there, it's still late July, and you have to be ready by early, the second week of September. That's when he needs to be ready. That's still a plenty of time to kind of get to a percentage healthy, where I believe that someone that got hurt when he did should be able to be ready, I would think. With my very little medical experience, Josh, might I also note on this, I do believe, off history of other players being hurt and things like that, he should be okay. It's just what level of Matt Milano we get is ultimately in question here. And we're really not going to see that until week one. Like, what if that ends up being when he starts? Whenever that first start comes, that's when we'll ultimately know what we have. And I think hopefully the coaching staff can kind of evaluate that overall, and maybe prepare best come week one. But if they believe, let's say, a 75% Milano is there come week one, and that's still better than 100% Dorian Williams or whatever it might be, so be it. And we'll just have to trust that. And then if come real games, come that week one game, all of a sudden it's like, oh no, 75% Matt Milano is a problem, unfortunately, still for this defense. That's where then, at least as we talked about last episode, it does feel like they kind of have emergency plan Bs and Cs back there that they can probably facilitate and make happen.
Yeah, they're in good shape at backup linebacker, much better than last year when they were forced to have AJ Klein come off the couch and start a playoff game. I think week one is interesting because the context of week one is unique. This isn't just Matt Milano. I think any player on the Bills that maybe gets banged up in training camp or banged up in preseason that comes into week one questionable, I think the Bills are going to be in a position where they have to err on the side of caution. Remember, the Bills play a non-conference opponent in the Arizona Cardinals week one, and then 4 days later, they travel down to Miami to play arguably their most important division game of the season in week two. And we all know how tough those 4-day turnarounds on Thursday Night Football can be injury-wise. If someone's banged up, they're not quite 100%, I could absolutely see the Bills giving them week one off, which, what a bummer to miss week one after you waited all year for it, just to make sure you're right for week two. Because if the inverse is, we can play you week one, but we're just not sure what that recovery looks like, can you be ready to go for another game week two? The Bills are going to prioritize the Dolphins game just based on the importance of that game in the standings versus a non-conference opponent. I don't know how much that relates to Matt Milano, because to me, that's more of a just 4 days longer rest kind of deal. But I just wanted to make that point. I am more confident than even I was on last week's episode, Luke. I started doing some research on his injury, and the specific injury is a right tibia fracture. I follow Banged Up Bills. Luka does too on Twitter, and he has some great observations. And just by looking at some pictures, he was able to determine that maybe Matt Milano's injury wasn't quite as severe as it could have been. It doesn't appear there was any ligament damage. And he did give some examples in his article of players that have had this same exact injury and come back in a 1-year span, one of which is JJ Watt, had that injury, came back the next year and had a 16-sack season. So his observation on this injury is it's like an 8-month recovery. If Milano's ready to go by week 1, then there really is not a whole lot of risk in him not coming back to peak performance. I will say, I share Luka's skepticism on that, not only because he's coming off of a leg injury, he is turning 30 in a handful of days. And, the older you get, the slower your recovery. He missed football last season after the first 5 weeks. So I embraced that almost sound like I embraced something. I am braced for Matt Milano not looking like all pro, third best linebacker in the ESPN power rankings of linebackers, and maybe just being a very good linebacker. And next to Terrell Bernard, that's just fine. Like Matt Milano doesn't have to dominate the league, but just come back and be a very good linebacker, and the Bills will be better off than they were a season before. Von Miller. Von Miller is a guy that last year was the biggest question mark coming into camp. And he said that he was going to be ready to go by the time the Bills went to London. And sure enough, Von Miller was on the field in London. And Von Miller played the rest of the year. And Von Miller's impact was about the same impact that Luka and I had. That's kind of a joke. He did make some good plays in the run, but there was no explosion in his pass rush moves. People that watched the film closely said that Von Miller did not look like any kind of a special player. He looked at times like a weakness out there on the defense. We are now another year removed from the ACL he tore two Thanksgivings ago in Detroit. Luka, do you think we are going to get a better version of Von Miller this season than last year? And if so, how much better is realistic to hope for?
I expect better. I do. I think he's a player of Von Miller's caliber. It clearly has a ton of pride, and they're very self-aware. And I would think, as much as he loves to put on a facade and a show, not in any negative say, I don't say that in a negative way. He likes to talk a lot. He enjoys himself, we'll call it, in not a kind of, maybe some of it's an egotistical way, of course, but I don't think it's like toxic or anything negative. But he's got to be self-aware enough to know how disappointing last year was on his return. And I bring that up because you would think that that would be a motivating factor to show people still, even at this point in his career, that he still got something. There's still something there. Now, the realistic thing is, as you mentioned with Matt Milano, the older you get, the harder it is to get up week in and week out and recover and things like that. And when you come off of clearly what was not a very clean ACL injury that hindered him massively last season, I don't think it's like we'll see, Super Bowl MVP Von Miller, of course. We're not going to see most likely pre-injury Von Miller, the early Von Miller, where we're like, holy crap, we actually got an ace at DN finally. But I do think we'll find an impactful Von come this season. I think that is realistic. I think that is there based off of him just being motivated enough to show that he still got it. And on top of it, he is a bit of a freak. Like, you don't get to the level that you are as Von Miller unless you are freakish athletically. And he has a lot of gifts. He has a lot of talent and things like that, of course. And again, what I said with Matt Milano, he's still the same player between the ears. So it's all there. His body let him down last year, clearly. And I'm hoping that a whole healthy offseason, where I don't think we really saw much of him in the public eye either for the most part. So what I would equate that to, because he is someone that, he finds himself on the McAfee show. He has his own podcast. He does all these things where if you're not hearing too much about him, it's probably because he's busy doing other things. And if that's the case, that's a good sign as a Bills fan that he's probably doing that to get himself into game shape and stuff like that. You hear about the things like, he looks great, when he was around in OTAs and stuff. It's like, wow, we're ready for Von and return back to previous form and stuff. I'll believe it when I see it, because unfortunately, last time we saw him on a field, it was very, very, very underwhelming. But I would definitely like to believe it's realistic that he will be back to at least being impactful, not super impactful, not superstar, but impactful. There's going to be value on having him at the edge and not feel like it's a detriment or a problem to the defense. It actually will have its moments that will shine.
if he doesn't improve from last year, if you just set the contract aside, then there would be a real talent conversation to be had of, is he one of the 53 best players on this team? Like, should he make the roster? I think he will improve from last year. I'm with you on that. I'm with you on the freak comment. I think his ceiling is still the best pass rushing edge on this team. That might say more about the edges behind him. But one thing I think is a very realistic role for Von Miller this year is maybe he's an exclusive third down pass rusher. Maybe he doesn't start games. Maybe the starting defensive ends are Greg Rousseau and AJ Epinesa. But when it gets to second and long and third and long or clear passing situations, that's where Von Miller comes on the field. Maybe, in a lot of ways, that's maybe the best way for his career to go, even if he hadn't gotten hurt at this point, where you save some wear and tear, you save some tread, you save some fatigue, whatever you want to call it. I think that player is still in there, and I think he can be a helpful player. Am I banking on Von Miller being a huge impact on this team? No, I'm not. I think that would be unfair and unrealistic based on what we saw last year. But he's at least a mystery box that I think there's a chance that when you open that box, there's something pretty cool inside. And that's a wild card for this team. Speaking of wild cards, speaking of mystery boxes, Kyer Elam, the Bills' #1 draft pick from 2 years ago, is reportedly doing very well in OTAs. Take that for what it's worth. The path for Kyer Elam being on the field is very clear, as Tre'Davious White is no longer a Buffalo Bill. Dane Jackson is no longer a Buffalo Bill. The presumed starters at cornerback are Christian Benford and Rasul Douglas. But that third boundary corner, first guy off the bench, right now looks like it's going to be Kyer Elam. Luka, what's your optimism level for Kyer Elam finally figuring it out and putting together a season that makes him a very useful contributor on this team?
Meh. It's very meh. I have no other way to describe it. It's not low, but it's not high. It is as meh can be. If meh was a word, I'm going to say meh one more time, because I'm not going to put any weight into it or hopefulness that it's going to happen. But I'm also not going to sit here and act like it's terrible if it doesn't either. I think what the Bills have done, one, of course, we talked about it for years now, it feels like. They really lucked out with that late pick that is Christian Benford working out so damn well. And two, they also did a really good job last trade deadline by ensuring that boundary and getting a Rasul Douglas in here that, of course, also appears to be a home run. So when you did the thing you needed to do to kind of ensure yourself on that boundary after what appears to be at this moment in time as a mistake with that first round pick that is Kyer Elam, I'm not going to fault you for it, because at least you recognize the issue quick. You lucked out with one thing, and then you damn well made sure that you didn't still have to depend on it in another way, and you solved that problem. And you did it in a very fast manner, I will say. Like, that is, I don't recall a lot of scenarios in the NFL where a team has a clear issue and they screwed up, and within 2 years completely solve the problem and everything is fine, where no one even talks about. I mean, unless you're really getting into the nitty gritty and trying to criticize Brandon Beane for something, whatever it might be specifically on that, like, you do not hear anything about that whatsoever. And that's a credit to Brandon Beane, and that's a credit to the Bills for kind of recognizing the problem and finding the solution quick. And if we need to depend on Kyer Elam at this point, we know what we're getting. It would be fantastic if the switch flipped. That would be absolutely unbelievable, because that immediately turns that into a bust, we just didn't recognize he needed a couple more years of development before he was really comfortable, and now everything's okay, as you then potentially let Rasul Douglas walk out the door or whatever it is. So I hope the switch flips. I can be hopeful that it works out, but I'm not going to get, I'm not going to find myself where it needs to in any capacity, nor am I comfortable even thinking that it's possible. And I just think you truly have a wild card. You truly have an unknown on what he is. And if he gets called into play, I think you have big play potential there, but you also have a big fuck up. Sorry. You have it there. Like, it is the most wild card-ish, better hold tight and hope it's not Tyreek Hill he's lined up against or whatever else it is. And, he's just got some average wide receiver too, who's not going to, at least burn him completely, or what, regardless of what it is. I just think that is the reality of Kyer Elam, and he is the ultimate meh going into this, where if we see the splash plays even in training camp coming up, you see the clips coming out, Josh, where it's like Kyer locked up Curtis Samuel today. I will literally not even bat an eye to it. I'll just be like, okay, show me on game day. Like, just, yeah, man, show me when the plays matter, because that's when you see the great still, but you also see the, oh my God, stop grabbing him, or the, oh my God, don't get roasted like that, please, for the love of God.
It's funny you said when Kaiir Elam's on the field, there's a potential for a big play, and there really is. It's a matter of which team it's coming for. So that's kind of the issue with Kaiir Elam to this point in his career. And when you look back at that 2022 draft and what the Bills' blueprint was in that draft room at that time, Tre'Davious White coming off the ACL injury, their goal in that draft was to get a rookie cornerback to pair with a veteran in Tre'Davious White to be their cornerback tandem for the next handful of years. And if you could ask Brandon Beane what his starting cornerbacks would look like in 2024, he'd say, my aging star in Tre'Davious White, who's maybe not the best version of himself, but still pretty good. And then my rookie from this class. Well, guess what, Brandon Beane? Your starting cornerbacks this year are an aging star, same age as Tre'Davious White and Rasul Douglas, and a rookie from that class. It's just not the two you thought, but it works out that way sometimes. That's what happened when they drafted John McCargo and Kyle Williams 5 rounds later, and Kyle Williams was a star and John McCargo was out of the league. I have not given up on Kaiir Elam. There is a very unique skill set there. He is a very good athlete. He has very good ball skills. I think it was a questionable fit when they drafted him based on the scheme they play at Florida and what the Bills ask cornerbacks to do. And it is only his 3rd year. The first 2 years have not gone well. He was inactive at times for Xavier Rhodes off the street. That happened in his career at times, but he also has multiple interceptions in multiple playoff games, an interception of Patrick Mahomes in the end zone in Arrowhead, and he's going into his 3rd year. And we all saw last year Spencer Brown go from being a guy that you're just like, is he ever going to put it together, to now he's a guy that we're worried we may lose, and can we survive without him if his contract runs out? So I'm interested to see what happens there with Kaiir Elam. Quickly on Spencer Brown, Luka, should the Bills extend him before the season? He is an unrestricted free agent after the 2024 season. He's coming off of a very good year, even got some votes in the top 10 tackle list on the Jeremy Fowler piece, which I thought was incredible. But there's issues about his injury history. There's issues about consistency. What do you do with the Spencer Brown contract situation?
I think you have one drafted up, but you're not really trying to push it before the season starts. I think you draft one up, you have those initial talks, you try to gauge the player's, number through his agent, but I don't think you're trying to get it locked in too quick, because I think the key point is here, there are those slight concerns about injuries. He did have a healthy year last year overall, and that was really the first time that happened. And we saw the output. It was good. Like, it was deserving of some of the, a vote or two for that. Cause I thought, in a world where offensive line, I think it's more and more difficult to find good offensive line play. Somehow, some way, the Bills have found themselves where last year's draft, we were like, please draft a tackle if possible, where I think the Bills are in a place where if you took those 2 tackles and compared them to any other team, there'd probably only be a handful of teams, maybe a handful plus, that you would take the tackles over what we have now. Deion Dawkins just continues to be like, Deion Dawkins is the one that makes no sense to me, because I just look at him just as an individual and I go, you're one of the best left tackles in the league. Like, it's one of those things, but then you watch him play and you're like, yeah, he's one of the best left tackles in the league. It just, I don't know. There's something weird about Deion Dawkins, and I love it. Let me just preface that. I love it. But then with Spencer Brown, I think you want to believe that he can be kind of that other bookend. You want to believe, and you want him to be that guy. You just have a couple questions in the back of your head where you're like, okay, where's your number at? Now, if it's a number you love to have that locked in at, go for it. But being in the world we live in today, I would find it very hard to believe that the agent would spit a number out that Beane could not write down on a piece of paper fast enough. So understanding that, you draft something up that feels like maybe it's going to be presentable to them and get you guys in that, the median area, whatever the meat area is. And then you maybe watch the season play out early on. And if it feels like last year's continuing as this year plays, that's when you present it. And you just go, okay, let's get this done before season's end. Things like that. And you don't have to get the player involved. Of course, if he has an agent and everything like that, it should be able to be handled without it affecting the player himself. We see extensions happen during the season throughout the league all the time. It happens in all sports. And I think it can be achieved. I think the desire for him to be the right tackle of the future, we'll call it, is there. I believe that to be true. I think they've stuck with him and not really drafted a replacement or anything. That shows you that they want him to be that guy. You just have to kind of, I personally, if I were being, I would just have to see it for like, let's say the first couple games, the first few games. If it still looks like it's there, because down the road, you could get hurt and it's not that if you get hurt, let's say banged up week 16 that you have to miss a week, I wouldn't even fault the player for that. It's just the grind of a season will eventually injuries come up. Now, if an extreme injury comes up, that's where you'll be thankful that you didn't get him signed yet early on in the season. But I think you have to play that game where it's like, let's just at least see we still see that same player we saw last year before signing the dotted line or before presenting this offer. Because I do think there's still a little bit of caution there with him. Is he still that guy? Because I am never a person that believes 1 year is good enough for me. I believe it. It's like everyone can have a great year if they just put it all together. Now, can they maintain that through an offseason? That is the key that I believe some players, I think most players do that. Just some don't. Like some just had a really good sequence of events. They really put it all together. And then all of a sudden they lost it all in the offseason. They never get it back. There are plenty of examples of that too. So that's kind of where I go personally. I don't know if that's how they're actually going to handle it, but that's where I take it.
I'm worried about the consistency piece, but I am worried about the injury. You're talking about a back injury. And for a guy that's 300 pounds, as tall as he is, in a sport that he plays where there's a lot of bending involved and bending while pushing a very heavy object that's working in resistance against you, I do worry about somebody having a bad back. It doesn't seem like a good mix to me. I'm with you, though. I think there's a world where Spencer Brown plays well enough to start the season that you're almost forced to extend him because you don't want to let a good young tackle go. They are so hard to find. That's the reason why you see so many of them go so early in the draft, despite the fact that they all have flaws, because teams without tackles cannot function offensively, and teams are desperate to find them. And for all the warts we want to talk about on the Bills, Luka brought it up. The Bills do not have to worry about their tackle situation, barring injury, this year in 2024. And that is a great, great, great place to be. Let's talk about Sean McDermott. I think nationally speaking, Sean McDermott has become a little bit of a laughing spot for folks. I think it's like, oh, wow, you have Josh Allen and you haven't managed to win a Super Bowl. Well, there's a lot of good quarterbacks out there that haven't managed to win a Super Bowl. It's the Patrick Mahomes era, folks, right now. It's tough to get one if you're not him. Sucks. But I think there is a very realistic conversation around Sean McDermott because there have been issues in these playoff games that have cost the Bills chances to win a Super Bowl. We all know what happened in 13 seconds. We don't need to revisit that. But even dating back to last year's playoff game where he elected to dress an unhealthy punter in Sam Martin, and early on it cost the Bills field position. Who knows the impact it had on Tyler Bass's miss? I don't want to blame it on that. But, you go into a game willingly with a hurt punter. And then, the fake punt call that they called instead of just going for it with Josh Allen, throwing the ball at the end zone instead of ticking the time down and trying to make that the last possession of the game. So either you're kicking a field goal to go into overtime or you're winning a touchdown to walk it off. There's been some yips from Sean McDermott in the big moments. The collapse in Houston was a collapse, and that was a young version of the Bills. We didn't have high expectations for them, but that was a collapse. And, they've been dog walked now at home by the Bengals in the second round. I mean, after the Chiefs game, Luka, the conversation was, get playoff games in Buffalo and we'll be just fine. When I say after the Chiefs game, the 13 seconds game, get playoff games in Buffalo, we'll be just fine. The only reason the Chiefs won this game is they were home and it was a miraculous finish and Arrowhead carried them. Last 2 years, the Bills have had division round playoff games in their building. And for a variety of reasons, you can make up excuses if you want to. Injuries this year, DeMar Hamlin the year before, they lost. And they lost convincingly to the Bengals. Was not even a fair fight. And the Chiefs game, it was just, they got outplayed. They deserved to lose the game, but they also did some things where they had a chance to steal the game and they did not put themselves in position to do that. That is a long way of asking you, is Sean McDermott on the hot seat heading into 2024?
No, he's on the lukewarm seat. I think you still have to be a playoff contending team. Like you still have to be that. You have Josh Allen. Yes, there's turnover, which we'll get into the later part of my answer, but you still have to be competitive. You still have to be a playoff team and so on and so forth. And get into the dance. Maybe is this a year where they can't make it 5 in a row? Potentially, when it comes to division championships, of course. Potentially. there is some turnover to this roster where maybe coming out of the gates, as you even mentioned earlier this episode, where you have non-conference opponent Arizona at home, and then 4 days later you got to play probably your most important divisional game. And then if you stumble out of the gates, even with that, going into the later stretch after that, that is difficult. You have the Ravens in there. The order of it, I can't remember off the top of my head. Texans are in there somewhere where you have Allen versus Diggs. Yeah. There's tough games where stumbling out of the gate, maybe you just can't secure the division, but you need to be competitive and you need to be making the playoffs. Now, if it goes cataclysmically wrong and everything goes awry, yeah, I think that's where the lukewarm becomes hot and eventually would lead to his firing. But why I don't believe he's a hot seat right out the gate is it is a transitional like season. And I think he has enough backing to him showing the success to the level at least that he has, that if you were to, let's say, be the 6 seed, the 5 seed of the AFC, you get into the playoffs and say you even win that game to then get back to the divisional round that you've been the past 2 previous seasons. Oh, I mean, you did that with what others are saying is less, right? You've done it with less. So what that would, if I were running this thing, I'd be like, that lessens you being the cause of why we're not getting there, right? Something else is you're just not getting something that's elevating you above it, but it's not you potentially that's limiting it anymore. Something else is there. We got to figure that out because you need to get over that hump eventually when you have Josh Allen. But ultimately, I think that's what at least reserves him off the hot seat, puts it on the lukewarm seat. I think there is cause for concern, and maybe where you are just like, hey, just continue success. It doesn't need to necessarily be at the Super Bowl contender level, but that Super Bowl is still on the mind, and it should be. Just let's see what we got, and you need to be competitive and still make the playoffs this season.
I think you answered that really well. I will say this. I think, is he on the hot seat? In my opinion, no. But that doesn't mean he's like 100% safe. Like you said, there's always things you can do to get fired. The hot seat conversation, I think, is under the guidelines of if a season goes within a realistic range of outcomes. If Sean McDermott goes out there with a fully healthy Josh Allen and wins 4 football games, he could get fired. That's not being on the hot seat in July of 2024. That's the season played out. Holy hell, the season went off the rails and we got to get you out of here. So I could see that. If Sean McDermott has something off the field pop up that, we've seen like Urban Meyer situation pop up or whatever, which there's no reason to believe is going to happen, that could happen too. But as far as like, if Sean McDermott has a season that's within like a realistic range of predictable outcomes, even if they're like on the barely outside looking into the playoffs, I don't believe he'll get fired. And I think one reason for that is how willingly and open he and Bean were to this reset, where they ate a lot of money this year to open up the books for future years. They got rid of some guys this year that they didn't have to get rid of. They didn't have to cut Mitch Morse. They didn't have to trade Stephon Diggs. They willingly did this for a tougher today, for a better tomorrow. But if the guys in that building aren't aligned that they're going to be there for tomorrow, they don't care about a better tomorrow. And the fact that they were so willing to do that tells me that I think Sean McDermott is safe. I think Brandon Beane is safe. They are slow rolling this thing as far as rebuilding it back up. I think it was a smart, necessary offseason. The third thing, this is the wild card. Everything I just said could go out the window if Sean McDermott has a great season, makes the playoffs, gets to the second round, runs into the Chiefs. If he has one of those moments where the Bills are, everything we saying in July goes out the window. If it's the fourth quarter of that game and there's a minute left and the Bills need him to make the right decision to win that game and he goes to door number 2 and his decision is the reason why they lose, I could see Terry Pagula giving him the outs. But for now, I think Sean McDermott is safe and I think he probably should be safe. Last topic, Luka, always fun around training camp. Roster predictions. We're not going to do a 53-man roster projection right now. Nobody wants to hear that. But I do want to hear, Luka, do you have a surprise cut? Who is one player that I think, I'm sorry, you were totally ready to jump in and I, of course, kept talking.
Yeah, you're good.
Who's one player that you think the majority think is going to be a Buffalo Bill in 2024 that you're just not so sure about?
I look at this roster and it's tough for me to like look elsewhere than this one player, but just my thoughts come back to it time and time again. And I just believe for a lot of reasons, it just makes sense. And it's shocking, I think, in the sense of you look at what they did in the draft, you look at what they brought in free agency, and you consider the question marks that are there at that position. And yet this individual finds themselves behind, we'll say, at least 4 players at that position. The Damar Hamlin as a Bill situation is probably coming to an end by the end of training camp by cut down. It is what it is. And look, this is a business. You got to do what's best for the team. And I think when you even saw Damar Hamlin out on the field in whatever capacity it was, it's not like Damar Hamlin even we'll call it injury, was someone that was like, you had to have him on the roster. He was just a depth player who played pretty well, but overall there was a reason he was a depth player. Now I think we'll call it a little step back, and there's probably a little bit of tentativeness in his game and things like that in the very, very small amount we've seen since that, again, quote unquote, injury. So I just believe you drafted Cole Bishop, you signed Mike Edwards, you brought in a D Delaney, you already have Taylor Rapp. Those are 4 safeties that I truly believe will be making the roster. So if that is the case, this is not a roster where you then have 5 safeties on it just because you want to hold on to Damar Hamlin. So realistically, he is your man out. Everything is nothing personal, of course. It's just the nature of the business, and that is just what it's going to be.
It's a hard conversation to have. It doesn't feel good to say it. I predicted he would miss the roster last year, and he made it, and good for him. I'm with you. I don't think he makes the roster. There's a reason why I let you go first, because if you hadn't said Damar Hamlin, you've been telling me offline. I had a feeling that's where you were going to go with this. I was going to say Damar Hamlin. I'm aligned with you. I think he has an uphill battle to make this team, and I think it's very realistic. It is tricky when you look at this roster because there's not like one established player on this team where you're like, yeah, I could see them cutting him. Because even in a world where you were like, oh, Dawson Knox, no, they just redid his deal. Like he's just fine. Mitch Trubisky, no, he's dirt cheap. Like they're not going to get rid of Mitch Trubisky. It's just hard to find that guy. Maybe it's Kyer Elam, but I don't think so. They're not good at boundary corner, and I think they've had opportunity to trade Kyer Elam dating back to drafts and preseason last year. They believe in this kid, I think, enough that they're going to keep him around. My answer is going to be Sam Martin. I think Sam Martin had a down year last year. I do think that the Bills think very highly of their backup punter in Jack Browning. I almost said Jake. I had to talk slower because I wanted to make sure I didn't say the wrong name. Jake Browning. Jack Browning from San Diego State, who has a boomstick of a leg, who was the kicker and punter at San Diego State. If this sounds familiar, but the one issue is, can he hold? He has been holding in OTAs for Tyler Bass. That will be his path to making the roster, is can he hold for Tyler Bass? But I do think that coming in, he has the opportunity to take kickoffs off of Tyler Bass's plate, really allow Tyler Bass to focus on that field goal kicking aspect. And the reality is an undrafted punter is much, much cheaper than a veteran year-to-year punter. I absolutely could see Sam Martin not making this team. Final question, Luka, before we get out of here. Do you have anybody, if you don't, it's fine, that you think is going to be a surprise make of the roster?
I've been thinking about it ever since I saw it on the outline. There is kind of a shakeup that I wouldn't be far surprised, but let me just put it this way. Ty Johnson's still someone you can cut. You did sign him to a 1-year deal. It is what it is. And you then have Frank Gore Jr. out there that could probably fill the same role for a slightly less cost. It's very slight. It's not a cost decision you're doing that on, but he's younger and you maybe have something better there. You, of course, have the pedigree that is Frank Gore, who you've had in house and you hold the very high regard. Frank Gore Sr. also holds the Bills organization in high regard. He is quoted saying it. So all things considered, I could see a path in a reality where you have James Cook, of course, as your primary back. You have Ray Davis, who you just drafted to bring in there to be that kind of that bowling ball of a guy. And I don't mean it like he's a fatty kind of deal, but it's just he's a short, stout kind of individual. But then instead of Ty Johnson out there, maybe you found something in Frank Gore Jr., an undrafted free agent, that kind of it tickles your fancy in the right way. And you're like, you know what, Ty, we appreciate what you provided us last year, but we're actually going to instead go with this guy. I can absolutely see that happening. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but
Yeah.
that is something that I look at and I go, I could absolutely, I don't even need to talk myself into it. That is a scenario I see happening if it happens.
Yeah, it's a keep your eye on it. It's not a prediction, and I think there's several reasons to think that if Ray Davis comes in and hits the ground running and as good as they expect him to be, he's going to be RB2 on this team. And then you have to ask yourself, how much do you want to pay RB3 if Ty Johnson doesn't win the kick return job, or if Frank Gore comes in and looks really really good, and Ty Johnson is going to be 27 the second week of September. We've seen running backs at the age of 27 lose explosiveness and fall off a cliff. That world is out there for Ty Johnson. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then so Frank Gore Jr. would be your surprise make of the team. I don't think this is a surprise anymore. I think people are starting to get on this bandwagon, but just in case you haven't heard us say it, I think Luka might be aligned with me on this. I think Chase Claypool is going to make this team. I think he has a skill set that the Bills have been kind of chasing. We saw it with Keon Coleman in the draft. I think Chase Claypool is a talented player. I think he has at least a chance to impress and make the most of this last opportunity. I think Chase Claypool and MVS are going to be the 5th and 6th wide receivers to round out this roster. And I think that they both provide the Bills with something that the rest of the roster doesn't. Justin Shorter, neither one of us have him making the team. And I think both of us, even though he's a draft pick from last year, think so little of him, we didn't want to even call him a surprise cut at this point. It was just like, no, he's not going to make the team. All right, Luka, this was fun. I'm excited for training camp. It's the best time of the year. If you're out there playing NCAA, hopefully you enjoy it. Let us know in the comments. We will talk to you next time on Bills Chat when we have some training camp updates for you. Until then, I am Josh McCarty. He's Luka, and we'll see you next time on Bills Chat.